Okay, this slideshow is going to look at basic ecological principles, characteristics of ecosystems, characteristics of biomes, foundations, food chains, food webs, limiting resources, and things that can disrupt it. We're going to move and consider this from the perspective of complex adaptive systems like you see in the Lake Apopka PowerPoint. So what are the characteristics of ecosystems? It's organisms interacting with each other and the non-living world. So soluble chemicals taken up by plants using the energy from sunlight to photosynthesis. Those calories and those carbon atoms are then passed on to primary consumer, passed on to a secondary consumer. Ultimately, the organisms die, broken down by decomposers, and bring those soluble chemicals back into the system. So it's a set area that's relatively similar in terms of habitat, where organisms interact with air, water, sunlight, soil, etc. So how big or small are they? Well, the biggest ecosystems might be something like an ocean ecosystem. The open ocean ecosystem covers large areas relatively similar in terms of their type. A typical size would be more like a watershed, such as you see on the left-hand diagram. Each of these areas that has the little triangle, that's a study site, a gauging station on a stream, where everything in the watershed then leads to that point in these little streams that feed into the Bitterroot River. On the small side, you might have a small pool gouged out by a glacial block of ice, or a pitcher plant that then has a little bit of water at the bottom, or a tank bromeliad. A bromeliad is a type of plant in the pineapple family that actually can catch the water, and in a lot of tropical areas, these provide habitat for algae, zooplankton, and even tadpoles can spend their entire lifespan in one of the tank bromeliads before metamorphosing to the adult phase and hopping out. In terms of the biomes, this is Whitaker's classification scheme for the biomes. Whitaker basically broke down all of the ecosystems of the world based on their average annual temperature and average annual precipitation. So on the left-hand side, between 20 and 30 degrees Celsius on average, you have tropical conditions. The wettest areas are tropical rainforest. A little bit more dry is a tropical seasonal forest. These usually have a wet season and a dry season. You get a little bit more dry, you're in a thorn forest, thorn scrub savanna, and even more dry, you're at a desert. In the temperate latitudes, between maybe 5 and 20 degrees on average, wet conditions like in the Pacific Northwest give you a temperate rainforest. Intermediate levels of rain give you a temperate forest condition like we have in the mid-Atlantic region of the United States. A little bit more dry woodland, grassland, shrubland. Think Mediterranean climate. And then you get even more dry and it's a desert. More cold, averaging around 0, would give you a taiga condition, which is a boreal forest, spruce, fir, hemlock, those kind of plants. And then even more cold on average, where it's on average it's always below 0, maybe minus 10, minus 5 degrees. Low precipitation, that would be a tundra condition. The ground is permanently frozen below the top 2 or 3 feet. The biotic component of the ecosystems is the living things, and these are broken down to their trophic level or their feeding level. Producers capture sunlight or undergo chemosynthesis to then convert carbon from inorganic to organic forms like sugars. They're fed upon by the primary consumers, zooplankton in this case. They are then fed on by secondary consumers, the bluegill in this case, and then largemouth bass would be the tertiary consumers, the top link in the food chain. Anybody that dies then is broken down by decomposers, shown here. That's the living things. The non-living things are air, water, sunlight. Living things make up part of the grazer food chain. So this is rooted in plant productivity at the base. So Canada goldenrod is the plant here, eaten by a grasshopper. The consumers then utilize the available energy from the producer. The blue jay, the secondary consumer eating the grasshopper, then utilizes a portion of the grasshopper calories. The Cooper's hawk, then preying upon the blue jay, includes a bit of its calories. As we'll see later with the food pyramid, you get less energy as you go up the food chain, so this limits us to 3 to 5 trophic levels. And it's similar to that we'll see in the detritus food chain, which is based on dead, decaying organisms. So the detritus food chain, if you have a fish that dies and it's broken down by bacteria, it also could be eaten by a primary consumer, like a detritivore, crayfish in this case. Largemouth bass doesn't care whether it's eating something from the grazer food chain or the detritus food chain, it just wants food. So it could eat bluegill from the grazer food chain or the crayfish from the detritus food chain. And then the top carnivores can rely on either type of food. The otter in this case could rely on the grazing food chain, and really these kind of come together. But this emphasizes the availability of decomposing organic material as a food source. And the detritivores eat both the bacteria and the thing that the bacteria are breaking down, or fungi. So the food web interactions, we put it together in terms of a web. This is a map of the ecological interactions, from plants to grazers to intermediate predators to top predators within the system. It shows kind of a network of interactions, like you would have a street map. Shows all the available interactions versus if you're using a location app like Apple Maps or Google Maps, it's going to tell you, go in this direction, turn left, and then go 2 miles and then turn right. Rather than, hey, there's a whole bunch of different streets that you could go on to get there. So that's the difference between a food chain and a food web. Many food chains are simple. If you have a simple ecological system like this California stream on the left-hand side, algae at the bottom eaten by tuft-weaving chironomid worms, eaten by predatory insects, roach fry. Roach is a fish. You see one in the upper left. The small ones are going to eat the chironomid worm. Stickleback is kind of a spiny little fish. Those are all then eaten by steelhead trout, which is basically it's a rainbow trout, but it undergoes migration to the ocean. And those then can also be eaten by large roach. So it's pretty simple, not a whole lot of ways that the energy can flow through the system. In contrast, the diagram at the right is a tropical food web from a tropical stream. And even with just 10 fish species in that system, you can see this looks like a mass of spaghetti with all the different detrital food resources, primary producers at the base, the next trophic level, the next trophic level. And for the dots that are kind of in between those trophic levels, they would be omnivorous. They might eat from more than one trophic level. In some cases, the food chain can get disrupted. And a good case of this is in Lake Victoria in East Africa. There were 500 species of cichlid fish that were endemic to that particular area, over 300. Since then, they have identified more by DNA techniques. But these were collected by locals using subsistence fishing, dried in the sun, and then it could be stored for a long period of time. They decided, let's introduce a large predatory fish. We'll have something more to catch, and you get 6 to 8 foot long Nile perch growing within the system. This was done in the 50s and the 60s, and it had a massive impact on the rest of the system because this can eat pretty much anything there, and basically led to the extinction of many species and caused the dramatic decline of most others. So before the introduction of the Nile perch, and again, this is a simplified one, more than 400 species there of all different types. Many of these are cichlids, which are the angelfish family, ones that feed on the bottom, ones that feed on insects, ones that feed on mollusks or snails, and then the piscivorous ones at the top are fish that eat other fish. And it includes the catfish that you can see here, as well as cichlids. Planktivores feed on plankton. A really complex system, and in a lot of different parts of the thing, deep water versus shallow water, you might have different species. The Nile perch was introduced, it was basically Nile perch. The omena was one of those planktivores in the middle on that last diagram, but pretty much every other one has been driven near extinction, or they're restricted to the low oxygen marshes on the edge of Lake Victoria. The introduced Nile tilapia remains as the benthivore, eating benthic materials. Young Nile perch will feed on plankton and benthic invertebrates. Large Nile perch eat omena, mysid shrimp, and they are also cannibalistic, so they'll eat the young Nile perch as well. If it fits in their mouth, they're going to eat it. So this has greatly simplified the food chain to just 3 dominant species. So if we look at this in terms of our stability domains, you have stability domain A and stability domain B. At the bottom of each of these, it's stable. You can have a little bit of a disturbance, and the marble will roll back to that particular area. But if you have a massive disruption, like introducing the Nile perch, it'll shift it to a completely different ecosystem state, one that's dominated by those species and not the others. So what changes we're seeing in Lake Victoria? Complete extinction of many species of endemic cichlids. Hundreds and hundreds existed there previously, and in that region there's 2,000 distinct species just in the angelfish family. Loss of biodiversity from many abundant species reduced to 3. The native fisheries was basically destroyed. Now you have to have the equipment to catch Nile perch, and then what do you do with it? You can take it to a fish processing plant that then employs local citizens, but then the resulting meat that's packaged, the locals can't afford it. Beforehand, they could just catch fish and dry them in the sun. Now there's actually been deforestation of the surrounding landscape, because if they catch a Nile perch, cut it into little strips and things like that, they have to smoke it or cook it. And so you have to acquire wood from the surrounding area in order to do that, and it's led to deforestation. In ecosystems, there are a number of different factors that can limit the growth of a population. By Liebig's law of the minimum, it's usually one factor that ultimately limits them. So let's take temperature and fish. It could be one of the abiotic factors that limits and a particular organism. Above a certain temperature, goldfish would become infrequent or non-existent. Below a certain temperature, infrequent or non-existent. So you have that range for optimal survival. Same sort of thing with nutrients. Plants have to get enough of those nutrients, but they're going to be limited by just one resource that's in short supply. If you're a cactus in the desert, you can fertilize that all you want, but that's not going to increase the growth of the cactus unless it gets some water, because water is the thing that's in short supply. In some places, there can be biotic limiting factors. A predator, a competitor, there's might be plenty of ideal conditions, but they're not able to get enough food because the competitor takes it out. Or there's plenty of food for them to eat, but they're eaten by predators, so that limits the population. So again, Liebig's law of the minimum says that only one factor limits the growth and abundance of that population. So some examples. This is the experimental lakes area in Canada. Dave Schindler and his colleagues studied these areas. This is Lake 226. There's so many lakes up in this area that they actually name them by number. It's a figure 8-shaped lake, and they wanted to investigate nutrients, whether nitrogen or phosphorus had an impact on algae growth. Back in this time in the 60s, they didn't know. And they had done some small-scale experiments that suggested phosphorus was the thing in short supply. If you add phosphorus, it increases algae growth. So the near basin, they added carbon and nitrogen, no change. The rear basin, carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus. And with the phosphorus, the blue-green algae population just exploded, made this big algae scum all over the top of the surface of the lake. And this was then enough to have the government of Canada and the province governments basically ban phosphorus from laundry detergent as a quick way of getting that out of um, the aquatic systems. And in the United States, most of the states that border the Great Lakes did this as well. The exception was Ohio because Procter and Gamble, a prominent soap manufacturer, is headquartered in Ohio, and so there was political pushback. So this represents another type of complex adaptive systems. Lake can exist as clear water systems, oligotrophic, unproductive system. Trophic, in this case, means like how much productivity occurs within the system. So oligo means not very much, so low productivity systems, or turbid systems, eutrophic systems. If you push in a lot of nutrients, it can shift the system from a clear state, stability domain A, into a turbid state, stability domain B. Overgrazing of grasslands would be another. On the right-hand side is a normal grassland for this area. If you bring in too many cattle and you overgraze the land, it removes the grassland, it erodes the topsoil, and you have the situation that you see on the left. The only plants that survive are the ones that are resistant to grazers, and you've shifted it from one stability domain to another.